Great. And I see, great. Julie's there at the head of the table. Wonderful. All right. Howdy. All right. Well, hello, everybody. It's good to see faces. Haven't seen in a couple months, it feels like. This is a meeting of the steering committee, the Vermont Climate Council, if you're joining us. We have an agenda that I'm happy to run through, but Secretary Clauser, anything you'd like to say to kick us off today?
No, I'm happy to just jump right in and get started. I know we have a lot to cover today.
Great. Okay, super. All right, so we have a quorum, and it's actually not even just barely. So we're in better shape than we thought. Summer's tricky. This is the agenda that got sent around. Let me just walk through it quickly so you know what we have on deck for our meeting today. We've got an hour and a half on the books. And in addition to the sort of the basics here of approval of minutes, we have Joyce Manchester here from the Joint Fiscal Office to walk us through the report they did and the work they're doing, and they were asked to do under statute. So Joyce is here to help us walk through that. And Joyce, we thought we'd take, a half hour to do your presentation and conversation, if that works out for you. And then we have a discussion around a proposed letter and what to do with that around the clean heat standard that the cross-sector subcommittee was working on. And there's a discussion about the next steps and about how to make that work and do that appropriately if we were going to send that out in the council's name. So we'll take about 25 minutes and figure out a pathway for dealing with that letter. And then we need to do some thinking about our August meeting, which right now is the last meeting we have in the books before we start our meetings in the fall with the council. And so we've prepared a sort of a thought piece about that slide that's linked there about the things that we would need to work on ahead of getting together as a council. And so we wanted to spend a little bit of time on that so that we feel we're setting ourselves up for success in August as a steering committee and doing everything we need to do before the council reconvenes in the fall in September. Okay, public comment, as always, towards the end of the meeting, we have it scheduled for 12:45 and a 1 p.m. adjourn. Okay. Before we get going on this, any questions or concerns on this agenda for today? Great. All right, let's do it. So first things first. And I see a hand from Cheryl. Cheryl, we're going to do some public comment at the end of the meeting. Is it something you need to deal with right now?
Yes, I'm requesting that, especially because of the agenda and what you're going to talk about, I'm requesting that we really do public comment right on time, because I'm going to probably have something to say and possibly others will. So please, let's do it at 12:45.
Great. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Okay. Super. All right. Okay, let's do the first thing, which is approval of the minutes from last week. You can see they're linked right there in the agenda if you want to take a moment and pull them up and review, or I'll just give folks a moment to approve last week's. I see Jared's giving a thumbs up.
To say they look good. I did notice a few very minor copy edits, spelling things, names that I sent to Jane, but nothing substantive. So
nice catch. Thanks, Jared. Anybody need more time or have any concerns about the minutes? Okay, let's consider those approved. Thanks so much. Okay, so that brings us right into Joyce's presentation from JFO. And Joyce, I'll turn it over to you, and you should be able to share your screen, or Marion can make sure you can. And like I said, let's take until 12:05 with this. So whoever might you want to present, and then let's have some back and forth with the counselors on the steering committee members on this. So let me turn it over to you.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Joyce Manchester with the Joint Fiscal Office. I want to acknowledge right up front that we'll be talking about an issue brief that was co-authored with my colleague, Julia Richter. She's on her way to a conference in DC today, so she couldn't join us, but certainly she helped a lot on this report, and she will continue to work on the climate change issue going forward. I must say it's a pleasure to talk to you all. I've been following you by Zoom or by recordings, so I've been watching your progress for many, many meetings, and certainly appreciate all of your efforts. So as you know, the Joint Fiscal Office is the nonpartisan staff for the legislature. We consist of about 14 people for all 180 legislators. That means that we are not super experts on any one topic. We have to cover a wide variety of subject areas. I am trained as an economist. I am certainly not trained as a climate change economist or environmental economist. So Julia and I put our heads together and tried to pick out some of the highlights from the climate action plan that we felt it was important for legislators to be aware of. So we try to keep our issue briefs relatively short, knowing that legislators are citizen legislators. They don't have a lot of time to spend on any one subject area, but that there are some significant nuggets from the climate action plan that they should be aware of. So that was the purpose of our report. As mentioned earlier, of course, it is in statute that we had to produce a report. In the Global Warming Solutions Act, it states that JFO should analyze the economic, budgetary, and fiscal costs and benefits of the plan. Now, it was much too early to do a thorough analysis of the fiscal costs and benefits, the economic effects, and so forth. We simply do not have the detail to look at all that, but we did want to pick out some highlights in order to bring those to the attention of legislators. If it's helpful, I can share my screen and we can walk through the report that way. Otherwise, I can, I'm seeing some nodding heads. Okay, let's do that. Okay, I believe you can see my screen. I cannot see everybody, and I'm very happy to have comments or questions as I'm going through the report. So please speak up or raise your hand, or maybe someone can help me if there are questions as we go through this. So this is an issue brief. It's just 8 pages, and we tried our best to do justice to your much more extensive report. As you can see, we reminded legislators that we do have a charge to write a report about the climate action plan, but that we don't have the specifics to do a thorough investigation at this point. So let me first show you these bullets that represent our highlights as we saw them. Of course, Global Warming Solutions Act requires those greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced, and that Vermont must adapt to climate change. So we tried to let people know that the climate action plan presents an illustrative set of actions that could be taken, but not necessarily the specific actions that must be taken. Now that's a little bit tricky because of course legislators want to zoom in on specific actions, and we're trying to say, well, this is one set of actions that could be taken, but there are others that could happen as well. Okay, so we then highlighted the fact that there would be net benefits to Vermont's economy as represented in the Pathways report of about $6.4 billion over 30 years, primarily in avoided costs relative to the business as usual case, but that through 2030, there would be net investments that would be necessary. So this is a warning that things start off on the negative side and then move to the positive side in the long run. Next, we felt it important to tell legislators that they have an important job to do in policy design, so they can influence how policies are implemented in order to make things run smoothly and in order to avoid any specific hits to different segments of the economy, so that they know that different types of people will be affected by changes to achieve those emission reductions. And it's very important to think through the policy implementation. Next, we wanted to highlight the voluntary public participation in the various programs that would result in emissions reductions, so that legislators would think hard about where investments need to be made for incentives to get people to adopt heat pumps or engage in weatherization, switch to EVs, and so forth. And you'll be hearing from me in just a few minutes that part of our summer work will involve looking more closely at the kinds of incentive programs that seem to be effective and how that might work in Vermont. Next, we wanted to highlight the fact that the climate action plan is set out according to specific sectors, but that there needs to be a lot of thought also about the overall economic picture. If you look specifically at sectors one by one, you might miss some of those interactions, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the rest of the report. Unfortunately, we know that the transportation sector and the building or thermal sector do not yet have actions that are fully formulated, and that those two are the biggest emitters of emissions in the state. So we wanted to raise that bit of uncertainty with the legislators. Next, we once again highlight that the scope and size of the necessary incentives and subsidies to be sure that we have broad public participation have not yet been formulated, need to be determined, and that will come with time. And finally, this being the legislature that has a lot to do with appropriations and funding and so forth, we wanted to highlight that future sustainable funding sources and their allocations have not yet been identified. So now let's go through the report. There's more detail coming in the pages that follow. I started off with the very nice figure from the Energy Action Network that is also in the Climate Action Plan. So it certainly shows how the emissions need to be reduced over time. Let's see, we don't need to read every word here. We do mention right up front here that the Transportation Climate Initiative Plan was not able to be implemented, which is unfortunate. And also that the clean heat standard was vetoed and not passed by the legislature over the veto. So again, we wanted to raise those right up front to make legislators aware of problems there. Maybe I should say issues, not problems yet. Okay, so let's get into the discussion of some of the key points. As we mentioned, we have these emissions reductions targets. We also need to adapt to climate change. You'll see that our report was more focused on the emissions reductions because that's a more quantitative and near-term goal. It's absolutely true that Vermont has a lot of work to do in terms of adaptation and resilience, but it's just harder to identify exactly what needs to be done when and how to measure all of that. So yes, that's really important. It is not such a big focus of our preliminary report here. We do acknowledge up front that meeting those 2025 and 2030 requirements will require some significant shifts in consumer behavior and investment decisions. I think people need to know that there are going to be some shifts in the economy and in the way that they live day to day, but that these are good shifts in the long run, and that we are investing in our future. So we also cite here the Pathways report, confirming that the required reductions would be achieved if the illustrative actions from the CAP were implemented, or an equivalent suite of actions. Next, we talk more about that $6.4 billion net benefit over 30 years. And again, talk about the investments that need to be made up front. I did put together this chart as a way of showing people how the net benefit comes out of the new costs as well as the avoided benefits. And I hope some people will find that to be useful. Of course, that does not show the timing of the investments, but again, we highlight that in the paragraph just underneath the figure there. Then we get into policy design and implementation. We highlight the fact that policy design is really important. In particular, everybody loses if policy is not designed well. Well, can I say that? Everybody will gain if policy is designed well. Maybe I can't say that. But we should do the best job we can in designing policies such that there are no significant negative effects on certain types of households. Then we talk about relying on the voluntary public participation and again, acknowledge the fact that significant behavioral shifts are necessary. I think sometimes people think that other people are going to adopt EVs and weatherize their homes and install heat pumps. And it has to be true that all Vermonters are in the conversation together so that people from all walks of life, low income, high income, rural, urban, people who depend on transportation for their livelihood, everyone who works in a heated office building, all Vermonters must recognize that this is a big shift, that it's necessary, and that it's a good investment for the long term. Okay, next we move into the specific sectors: transportation, buildings, electricity, agriculture, and other non-energy sectors, and suggest that we should also be aware of the overarching elements of change. And here I'm thinking specifically about the fact that if we are concentrating on the thermal sector and the transportation sector, we are requiring a lot more electricity generation. And we may be installing lots of charging stations and so forth and so on. All of that is going to affect the emissions that are happening throughout the economy. And they're also putting huge demands on the electricity sector. So at some point, we've got to put all that together and recognize that there is an overall economic effect that will happen, whether we are ready for it or not. In talking to other people about what JFO could offer to this conversation, we also became aware of the interplay between broadband and housing. So I have an electric vehicle. I can set the charge time and the charge amount from my iPhone. If you don't have broadband, if you don't have access to the internet and so forth, that's going to be really hard to do. If you're trying to find a charging station, again, you need to have access to broadband. If you live in rental housing and you don't have a charging station on site, that's definitely a deterrent to easy adoption of a EV. So there are all these interactions among different sectors of the economy, and someone needs to be thinking hard about all of that. We have 3 areas of concern, and none of them should be surprising to you. The transportation and building sectors do not yet have policies put in place, as you know. I was interested to read the letter that you all are working on later in this meeting, and I think that takes a step in the right direction, certainly, in terms of the clean heat standard. But yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done, and the demise of the TCIP is also a big concern. So yes, we are just alerting legislators to the fact that there's a lot of work still coming down the pike. Next, I'm not sure that we yet understand how to engage all of the Vermonters who need to be part of the conversation. Certainly, there have been different stakeholder meetings. I know that you all have tried very hard to involve folks from different parts of Vermont society, but it is going to be a real challenge to get the word out to everyone and to explain what the options are for moving forward. So we are, again, just highlighting that point here. And then finally, we have a bit of notification to legislators that we do need to invest significant public funds in order to get people involved, in order to get heat pumps installed, weatherization done. I'm sure that legislators are aware of this, but the scope and the size of the investment that is likely needed may not be at the front of their minds. So this is a bit of upfront warning. Are there questions about all that, or did we miss something big as you look through the report today so far?
Go ahead, Jared.
Joyce, thank you so much. I think this is a great summary, and you did a really impressive job distilling a lot of information to some really important key points. So overall, just really grateful for your work here. A couple of things that I want to raise that I think may be challenging kind of areas of translation, especially when talking to the legislature about this. And you know, we struggled with this in terms of when we were defining terms in the Pathways report. You know, if you look at that, the introduction to the Pathways, it makes a distinction between actions, which they, you know, Cadmus and EFG are really referring to specific activities or benchmarks, or, you know, when EAN did our Pathways analysis, we called them measures, like the specific things, the weatherizations, the heat pump installations, the electric vehicles replacing fossil vehicles, the specific measures, actions, activities that would add up to reducing emissions. But one of the things that I worry about is that when we use that term actions, what legislators often think about, and what people understandably, you know, whether they're, you know, members of the public or the council, hear and think when we say actions is policy actions. And that was more in the policies and programs area. And the reason I'm bringing up the distinction is because you used the phrase, I think in the paper and in your presentation here, Joyce, about an illustrative set of actions. And I think that the Pathways model was an illustrative set of activities and measures that all together would add up to meeting the Global Warming Solutions Act targets. Illustrative because if we fell short in one area, we could increase another area. But I wouldn't want people to think that the recommendations, specifically the policy recommendations or the policy actions, which is not a term we used in the Pathways report or that you used here, but I think I hear legislators talk a lot about what is the policy action necessary. Those were not illustrative, as you know. I think that's an important point to say that there were very firm, clear policy action or policy recommendations that are in the report that are not illustrative. So I just wanted to bring that up. I think the other thing that's really worth mentioning, and I've heard you speak to this before, and again, it might just be one of those issues that I'm concerned about making sure it doesn't get lost in translation, is when we talk about the difference between the investment needed to realize this transition versus the kind of the savings or benefits that can be achieved, especially over the long run from those upfront investments. I do think it can be really helpful to remind folks that that's economy-wide, a combination of public and private investment, and that full investment figure is not a public investment figure. I mean, I think we expect that there are certainly upper income Vermonters, upper middle income Vermonters who are making investments of their own accord because they can see the benefits of getting off high cost and price volatile fuels, but that the need for the public investment will be to make sure that we're supporting lower and middle income Vermonters with appropriate incentives and grants so that they can come out ahead. I just don't want someone to see that overall investment figure and think it's a public investment figure. I don't think we yet know what share of that overall investment will be public investment, but it's certainly, not all of it or nowhere near close to it. Those are my two thoughts. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Those are both two very good points. And I think you're absolutely right about the investments needed. I don't think we specified in the report that that was a combination of public and private, but certainly when we talk to legislators, we can make that very clear.
Great, thanks. Chris, I see your hands up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking on a gargantuan task. We're basically looking at how our fundamentally changing our relationship to everything from energy to land use and everything else. And appreciate all the work and thought that you guys put into this. Two things I would just suggest is just for your thoughts going forward, and if there are future iterations of this. One is adaptation resilience, the costs of not investing in those, if sufficiently, and that's across the board, not only human health concerns. I know the flooding gets a lot of the headlines, but the deaths actually occur as a result of increasing heat days, and what we need to do to actually invest in making our communities more livable and providing accommodation for those most at risk and most vulnerable. But also with regard to the flooding, the investments we need to make not only in protecting, especially our compact settlements, so many of which are located, along rivers and streams, because that was our source of energy at the time, back when it was we relied on hydropower, but also the need to permanently protect and conserve access to floodplains both above and below those compact settlements. That requires a big investment, and also really a revisiting of a lot of our regulatory structure, making probably more of that mandatory as opposed to kind of a town by town approach, whether or not they're able and willing to do the planning and and bylaw adoption that's necessary, and then administering those things. And the other one is maybe looking at some cross-cutting investments that are absolutely critical to making the climate action plan work, but also a number of other Vermont policies. And a big one is investment in the infrastructure that's absolutely necessary to make compact settlement possible. That's the state's #1 planning goal, and it's repeated in every regional plan. I would assume every town plan. But also, it's highlighted in the comprehensive energy plan, the Vermont long range transportation plan, and other things. I know the state has developed some tactics to address, kind of an immediate term where to direct spending, but we don't really have an overall strategy for especially water and wastewater investment to make compact settlement possible. And that's a big reason, frankly, why it's difficult to develop affordable housing at scale now, because we don't have the infrastructure to support it, except for in a relatively few places in the state. And if we don't get on that soon, we're going to continue to see ourselves be decades behind in demand. And, it's going to be, if we look at potential moves of people from out of state for whom Vermont is relatively affordable, and the impacts that has for people who are already here, making supply and demand of housing more untenable as prices will continue to go up for folk who are already here, where we'll likely have to see Vermonters leaving as people are unable to age in place. And that gets into the comprehensive energy plan, because our future development patterns need to be more compact for a whole variety of reasons. But right now, the pathway of least resistance is going to be large lot development on back roads. So just two big elements there that I think would help kind of strengthen the assessment or the outlook that are definitely related to the greenhouse gas reductions, but actually get to larger both green and I guess gray infrastructure investments that the state's going to have to invest in. But thanks again for all your work, and we'll look forward to seeing the analyses as we go forward with all of this.
Right. Thanks very much, Chris. I appreciate both of those points. I have often thought that I'd like to do a deep dive into incentives that exist in our state that either push people toward compact settlement or push people away from compact settlement, because there's a big push and pull between those two, and we are not yet all pulling in the same direction in terms of moving people into more compact living situations. So that's a big one for sure. And I also appreciate the point about the cost of not investing in the adaptation and resilience. Absolutely, two very good points. I see I have 1 minute left. So do you have another question coming up?
I was just gonna, in that, Joyce, ask you to say a little bit more about your next steps, because pulling on what Chris just said, like, hey, is there future iterations? Are you going to be able to dive into these other issues that this report didn't get into? Like, what are your next steps?
Yes, so legislators have specifically asked that over the summer, we look more closely at the kinds of incentive programs and subsidies that would help to encourage lower income, moderate income Vermonters to invest in EVs, weatherization, heat pumps, and the like. So we have hired a summer intern. She's terrific. She's working away. Maybe she's on this call, but she is working away on looking at different incentive programs adopted by different states and also the various programs existing in Vermont. We find that a lack of data in Vermont is going to slow us down. We really need better data on who is offered incentive programs, who takes up those incentive programs, and what's going on with the people who don't take up those incentive programs. So some states do have very nice dashboards that show you all of that information, some of that information. So there are some states that do it now. It would be great if Vermont could make that investment. I know it's another ask. But that's going to be really important going forward as we try to get more people involved.
Thanks, Joyce. And on the other issues, in terms of if you were to take up the sort of the cost look at the adaptation and resilience planning and what Chris was saying, is that something that's in your future or not?
So we do not have the capacity to estimate costs of resilience and adaptation. Certainly, if we were given that information, we would be happy to use it in further analysis. Yeah, I mean, if we are ever going to do an overall economic, budgetary, and fiscal impact analysis, we are going to need a lot more specific information that could then be used in a macro model that would look at the state of Vermont and so forth. But at this point, we need a lot more specific information about what actions will be taken, how will they be implemented, what are the policy implications of those actions, and so forth.
Thanks, Joyce. Okay, that's really helpful for steering committee members as we talk later about the kinds of things that you want to invest in, right? And the prioritization effort that's going to happen this fall, right? Joyce's comment that it's very hard for her office to do anything without a little bit more analysis. Okay, great. Well, Joyce, thank you so much for coming and presenting that that study you did. Is there going to be is the final version already out, or is there a final version that will come out?
The final version is out, and what you have is the final version. It's on our website and was sent to all legislators in early June. we may be doing follow-ups on this report. It really depends on what the legislature needs, how we can best help them move forward.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Joyce. All right, so let's move on to the next thing that we wanted to work on today. And Joyce, you're welcome to stick around or take off. The next piece is this letter that was circulated coming out of the cross-sector subcommittee regarding the clean heat standard. And there's two dilemmas here. One is the content of the letter. The other is the pathway for the council or whoever is going to send the letter to do that. And I'm just going to turn it to Jane for 1 second, because I know, Jane, you've been doing some individual back and forth with members about this. And even better, Secretary Clauser. So let me turn to one of the two of you to just frame this up a little bit, what you're thinking about some pathways for this letter, and then we can talk about the pathway and also the content of the letter. So Jane,
to defer to you first, or you want me to give my high-level overview first?
was that a question for Kristen or for me? Sorry.
I wasn't sure if she had a question first, or if you'd like me to just do a quick overview first.
Well, I think, why don't you do a quick overview, Jane, and that mine is more kind of background and process. So the quick overview might frame that.
Thank you. Rich Cowart has graciously joined us. He is the co-chair, the counselor co-chair of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. At their last meeting, there was a discussion of an action item around outstanding funds that were allocated for the clean heat standard the clean heat standard didn't pass, but the funding remained within the budget. And there was a discussion of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee around taking action around a letter to be sent. First, there was discussion from the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, and then there was a request to consider having it sent from the Climate Council. And so the letter has been attached to the agenda here for discussion around content, and then consideration of a process for the council to approve the letter to be sent under its letter, and from it to the legislature and other key components of the administration. So Rich is here to discuss more of the details of the thinking behind this letter. TJ graciously has come on line too, who is also the co-chair of cross-sector from the administration. And I think both of them can offer some more details around what's in the letter and the request. And we can discuss from there. But as far as the agenda, I did update it today, understanding that if the steering committee deemed this appropriate, the request would be from the steering committee to advance a special meeting of the Climate Council in the next week, knowing that the meeting of the Joint Fiscal Committee would be on July 28th to consider this funding that's still out there. So the steering committee will not approve the letter, but would approve a process of calling together the Climate Council to approve the letter in a special meeting.
Thanks, Jane. And Secretary Clauser, do you want to add on to that? Right, turn to Rich.
Yeah, maybe it's an add-on, maybe it's just a clarification. And I think it's more of the latter. So just so that we're all talking about the same thing here and not apples and oranges, the letter, at least the draft that I have seen, indicates that there is appropriations within the budget that are separate and apart from, or at least appear to be separate and apart from the clean heat standard, which is 8715 that was vetoed by the governor. And that's not completely accurate. So there is placeholder reference language in the budget, but there's no appropriation in the budget for this money. And so I think that is why Jane is discussing consideration by the JFO, or rather the Joint Fiscal Committee, because without an appropriation, the governor or the administration has no ability to direct this money anywhere without legislative action. It also talks about positions, the budget, just the way positions work in state government for benefit of folks. Those positions are associated with a number. They need to be legislatively created so that the administration can't create a position on its own. We can pull a position from the position pool, an already created position that's in a position pool. But we can't create a new position without legislative action or joint fiscal action. So I hope that's helpful. I just wanted to make that clarification before we start kind of talking about what to do or how to do with this letter. I think there are some things within it that just don't accurately reflect the budget and the appropriations this legislative session.
That's really helpful. Thanks for that. And that probably means that the text of the letter might need to be updated to reflect what you're describing, Kristen.
It should. So because there's no appropriation, there would need to be legislative action to do anything with that money. So it's legislative action in the next session, or there's authority, the E-Board has authority to make appropriations from the general fund. That authority is limited by statute, right? So expenditures have to be necessitated by unforeseen emergencies, according to the E-Board statute, and the total appropriations for the E-Board, or the total moves from the E-Board, can't exceed 2% of the general fund. So, that criteria is certainly met here, but those are the two options: legislative action next session, or E-Board action, assuming that it meets the statutory criteria set forth for the E-Board.
Okay, great. All right, so it's a little bit of complexity there, but if we take one step back, Rich, do you just want to say a word about the intent? Like, really, what this letter is trying to transmit, and then we'll figure out, if folks are comfortable with that intent, and then we'll make sure the language reflects it, and then we can figure out a pathway for bringing this to the council. So, Rich, can you just say a word about intent here?
Sure. First, let me say, Secretary Klausner, thanks very much for, the technical budget process info just presented. I've had a number of conversations with people, who have pointed out the difficulty that you've been, that you touched on as well. So let me just go to the intent, and the intent is to ask the administration and the Joint Fiscal Committee, and perhaps the Emergency Board, if that's what it came to take whatever steps they can take with respect to budgeting flexibility to advance the analysis that the governor's veto message requested with respect to the clean heat standard. And that's the simple intent. To the extent that flexibility exists, let's take some action instead of waiting another year or two to take action with respect to the thermal sector. And let me begin by saying I'm here on behalf of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee. The committee met and discussed this topic and authorized the Buildings Task Force to write a letter like this for the purpose of presenting it to the administration, particularly the ANR, DPS, and PUC. And so the letter, it was requested by the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee in order to make the point that we really can't wait another year or two to get going on addressing the thermal sector. And with respect to the overall sort of context of the letter, I guess I want to make a principal point that the council is a continuing body with a legislative mandate, and we have a responsibility to do more than create a plan, present a plan, and then sit around and wait until the time to create the next plan. I mean, we actually have a responsibility to engage the administration, to engage government bodies, the legislature, and to inform the public about where we stand with respect to the climate challenge and what we should be doing about it. And this letter, I judge, is just one action that the council can take to keep things moving, as opposed to what we've done in the past so many times, which is create a plan, present the plan, disband, and hope that somebody does something. If we have the opportunity to take actions to assemble the information that the governor's veto message called for, we should do it. And if we have the opportunity to conduct outreach and hear from Vermonters and let Vermonters know what the options are, we should do that too. We should do that as soon as we can, and not just wait around until the end of the next legislative session. It's going to be impossible to meet our 2030 objectives if we don't act as soon as possible with respect to the thermal sector. And so in that sense, the letter is, I think, perfectly logical in asking for two things to happen, or maybe really three things, although the public outreach is crucial and important to both numbered paragraphs of the letter. That would be first to commission an appropriate study, either through ANR or through DPS, PUC, ANR working together, some combination of those agencies, recognizing that there was funding in the budget to advance the clean heat standard, and as the Secretary pointed out, technically those funds, weren't appropriated for that purpose, so they fall into the general pool, and the committee understood that when we wrote the letter. We're looking for a way to reach, to take an action to make those funds available or equivalent funds available to advance the information needs that the governor called for. And second, while we're at it, to begin the public outreach process to hear from Vermonters and inform Vermonters about the challenge of the thermal sector and what the options are for actually meeting the mandates of the GWSA. The second numbered paragraph refers to actions that could be taken by the PUC to advance its understanding of the ins and outs and design details of potential clean heat standards. And the purpose of that is to recognize that when the time comes, if there is to be a clean heat standard, it's important for the implementers of that standard, which is obviously a regulation. It's important for them to understand the pros and cons of different design approaches and what different technologies offer and maybe don't offer with respect to costs, benefits, climate impacts, and so forth. It will be important at some point for all the agencies to understand, what are the impacts of these different choices. And to the extent that they can get ahead of the curve by understanding that those issues early, it will make the process more efficient and cleaner and more transparent later. So let me note that I think we got a really good, comment from Catherine Dimitrick about concerns that the letter was calling for a formal quasi-judicial investigatory process at the PUC, and that was, problematic at this stage of the game. And I tend to agree with that observation. I mean, I'm very well experienced with how the PUC operates, and I realize that there's a range of ways that they can work. We have in the past at the PUC, in close coordination with the department and other agencies, conducted multi-stakeholder collaborative investigations into thorny problems. And what I envision the PUC could do really productively in the next year would be to work with the department to launch a collaborative of that type. That would be it would be technically informal. It would be open to participation by multiple stakeholders, open to public comment. It could conduct outreach activities, collect a lot of information, and provide a forum for people to examine the nuts and bolts of a clean heat standard that would advance the whole process. Instead of waiting, as I say, another year or two to get going.
Rich, I'm just going to jump in because I want to make sure folks have a chance to do a little back and forth on this.
Yeah, that's fine. I think I'm at the end. I just wanted to note that I've drafted a revised paragraph number 2 and sent it to Jane if anybody would like to read that. I realize that there's a big question. I'm sorry, David. I do need to come back to the beginning. There's a big question here whether this is a letter that could just be sent by the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee, or should it be sent by the steering committee itself as the steering committee, not as on behalf of the entire council, or whether we should advance this for the full council. And that's your call, not mine.
Great. Thanks, Rich. So let's separate out for 1 second the process of who's doing the letter and how that's done from the content of the letter. And I know I've been watching the chat, and thanks, Rich, for that thoughtful sort of framing of the whole thing. The issue that seems to be popping up, at least in the chat, is the PUC as the entity. And I think that's what you're alluding to as well, Rich, and the sensitivity around that. And Jane just posted the sort of new version that you have. For Chris, yeah, I was going to go to you, Chris, right now. Chris, when you look at that new version, is that solving the issue you had, or are you thinking that that's still not addressing what you're talking about?
I guess let me be clear. I'm not knocking the Public Utilities Commission. I've engaged with them a lot in Vermont Yankee dockets, but also other kind of information gathering dockets, such as preferred sites for solar and others. And those inquiries even tended to be pretty much following the PUC rules. The procedures they follow anytime they open up a docket, which tend to be, yes, they will go out and have public hearings, but they're just that, they're public hearings. So the commissioners or their staff sit at a table, receive comment, but there's no exchange. So I guess, Richard, I'm just trying to visualize are there other inquiries that they've done in the past that have perhaps been more engaging with the public? And again, I'm not saying they've not solicited public comment or anything. I'm not knocking them but they have specific rules of procedure that they follow for everything that they do. And that's what gives me pause about bringing the PUC in at this point when, I think a lot of what we heard in the legislative session, and then once people kind of realized what was in the clean heat standard and what wasn't in it, there's more of a desire to kind of understand what this would look like for Vermonters and being able to engage on that. And I think that's also a concern that I'm not speaking for the whole Just Transition Subcommittee, but I think that's also something that it's flagged as far as really kind of getting into the nuts and bolts, engaging with, especially as marginalized populations, about what does this mean at a very kind of practical household business level, level. So,
Chris, can I just interrupt for 1 second to say, in your mind, would it be better to have the Department of Public Service be the sort of lead on this in collaboration with the PUC? Is that sort of your mental model of this?
Yeah, I'm not sure what that looks like. Again, I'm not, is the PUC in the background on that? I think I know the PUC pretty well, but Richard probably knows it better than I do. I'm just trying to figure out what does that look like from a very practical procedural standpoint. Are they more consumers of the information that would be gathered by the department or other entities, or are they a lead? Just how does that mesh? The other thing I'll just note too is I know that DPS sometimes struggles with sufficient resources to do the work that it needs, and I think a big qualifier would need to be that they would have to have the resources to fully do this work.
Okay. All right. So we're focusing on this paragraph, right? And I saw, Lauren, you flagged a concern in the chat as well, that centering the work around the PUC is causing a little pause. And I'm wondering if there's a way, in addition to the revised language that Jane threw in the chat, if there's something else that would make steering committee members at least feel better that, this point number 2 is well formulated. Is there anything else we want to say? I mean, Rich, do you want to respond to Chris a little bit about sort of, would it be better to have the Department of Public Service in the driver's seat on this? What to think about this? TJ, feel free to jump in too.
Yeah, I was going to ask TJ for a comment.
Yeah, so I wonder if the letter itself, the real intent of the letter is to get the process moving, and the who, I think there is a distinction between state agency within the administration and the PUC. And I agree with Chris that the PUC does have a pretty well defined process and has not done stakeholder engagement, the likes of which are contemplated by the Environmental Justice Bill or any of the more recent thinking on how to reach the people we really haven't reached in the past. I don't know that other state agencies have done a whole lot of that either, to be fair, and although we're trying. But I wonder if there's the letter maybe does not need to call out the who, if the intent is for the money to be appropriated, and because there are, it could, the department is a potential landing spot. There's other potential landing spots also. So I just, if the focus of the letter is really what is the content of, let's do the analysis and move the analysis forward and do stakeholder outreach, it may be worth discretion to the recipients of the letter to who does that.
How does that work for folks? What TJ is suggesting is sort of in that paragraph, make it less about the who and say, we would like this to happen so that we are making progress on what will need to happen in the future. Is that okay to leave it a little bit less directed?
David, I'm happy to chime in on that, although other
please.
people are deciding. First, I agree with what TJ said. There's no particular point, the letter was not drafted and with the idea that the PUC should be in the driver's seat. But for information purposes, it is worth noting that in the past, when we were first launching energy efficiency programs in Vermont, it was kind of similar to this circumstance. So we knew we wanted to do something on energy efficiency. It was really complicated. The PUC had a proceeding, but when we got to figuring out how to implement energy efficiency, it was important to have a collaborative. And the department led the collaborative. The PUC was involved along with a ton of stakeholders. And that collaborative was very successful in advancing the nuts and bolts of energy efficiency programs in Vermont. We did something similar a few years later with respect to the move towards competition in the electric sector. And so I can report that in the past, we have been able to invent procedures that are different from the kind of procedures that Chris is and most other people are familiar with, the docketed procedures at the PUC. So with that in mind, there's no particular reason to call out the PUC here. And
Can I make a suggestion then? And I'm also a little conscious of time here. In that, Rich, as you're saying, I wonder if there's two things that need to happen on the content of this letter. One is that this paragraph gets reformulated to be a little bit less directive about the who and more about the how and the what, right? And so you take the how and the what pieces of the paragraph and you loosen up on the who and let that sort itself out.
Yeah, that's
the
fine.
second piece of content that would need to perhaps be changed is based on Secretary Clauser's comments about the budget piece, so that when it's referenced, the 1.2 million higher up in the document, that we're saying things that are as accurate as possible about the state of play of that budget amount. So those are two specific changes that could be made to the document. And let me just check with steering committee members. Does that seem like appropriate changes to this letter? And then we'll deal with it quickly. In a second, we'll deal with how. Yeah. So I'm talking about those two changes. One is the second paragraph that's in the chat now, this number 2, less about the who and heavier focus on the what we're talking about and how we'd like to see that happen, right? Because that's in the paragraph. And the second is when we talk about the 1.2 million higher up, that we're making sure we're nailing it in terms of the actual state of play. Any concerns about making those two changes in this document? All good? I'm not seeing any concern. Okay, great. Secretary Clauser?
So it's not as a concern as much as just, I just want to make sure I'm being crystal clear that because the minus legislative action or authority, there's no, I'm hearkening back to the discussion of use whatever flexibility, existing flexibility there isn't any minus legislative action and authority because there's no appropriation. So I just want to be clear that the the agencies that the letter is directed to have no independent ability to use that $1.2 million minus legislative authority to do so.
Great. And that's what I was trying to get at with when we talk about the 1.2 million, it's talked about in a way that understands where the point of what needs to happen, right? And so if we can do that well in that, does that solve what you're saying? That we're clear about with the state of play and who we're talking to here. Yeah.
One.
Secretary Clauser and then Jared.
Go ahead. I mean, the clarification is important. I guess I don't understand. I just wanted it to be factually correct so that these folks know what what is and is not within the authority of the agencies and departments that the letter is the draft letter is directed to. So, so making it, I know it's not quite answering your question, David, but
Okay.
So what I'm hearing in what you said, Secretary Clauser, and tell me if this does not sound right, is that it's not so much about the phrasing or framing of that money. It's who the letter should be addressed to. And so it sounds like another kind of proposed edit to the letter is that it is addressed to the Joint Fiscal Committee, which would have the authority to act on the request, with a CC to those three agencies that the letter currently is addressed to.
so I think that yes, in part, Jared, I think that is correct, assuming that there's a decision that the request meets the statutory criteria of the Joint Fiscal Committee to act, right? So that would be something the JFC would have to, would have to decide upon, but it's also, I think, a consideration for folks sending the letter, because that criteria should be addressed.
Okay. All right. So who it's addressed to, the Joint Fiscal Committee sounds like the right place. A reference to the fact we understand that there are criteria that will need to be met, and we would like them to look at that, and then the letter and fixing that paragraph number 2. TJ, last word on this, and then I want to talk about who sends this letter.
Yeah, I have a clarification to another piece of the letter, but it raises a question as well. And the clarification is just in the letter, it says it was unanimous from the cross-sector mitigation committee. And whereas I had abstained from that vote just because, or clearly abstained, and it was because at that time, at least, thought the letter was going to the administration and that it wasn't appropriate for me to actually vote on this letter that may be coming to the administration that I work for. So that raises another process question, I think, for this committee and the council at large on exactly who is sending the letter and how that interaction works. And looks like Secretary Clauser, you may have the answer.
Yeah. And in that, Secretary Clauser, let's think about what Jane had said, which is essentially the default here is that the steering committee sets an extraordinary meeting of the council within a time period that works, like in the next 10 days or something. And then the council decides to send the letter on to the recipient. In this case, now we're talking about the Joint Fiscal Committee. But Secretary Clauser, can you help us with TJ's concern?
Or again, I don't know if it's helpful, and I think it will at least explain why it's been so challenging for me to talk about this issue. This type of request, I think, is very similar to the budget discussions we've had as a committee, in that members of the executive, to TJ's point, members of the executive branch can't, outside of the governor's budget, which we advocate for and support, make policy budgetary recommendations to Joint Fiscal Committee or to the governor. So I guess that is to say, regardless of whom the letter is addressed to, I think it would be fairly, I don't think executive branch committee members would be able to vote and would have to abstain, just like TJ did when the discussion was to forward the letter on. So I add that as an added piece of complexity with respect to those kind of procedural decisions moving forward.
Yep. And we're going to find it again in the budget stuff. Yep.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. So we're clearing all that up. And I just want to check in with steering committee members, though, with the general philosophy here, which is the council is the right body to send this letter. We should set a meeting of the council in the next 10 days or whenever it's, so we can get it in before the July 28th meeting, the Joint Fiscal Committee. And we can bring a revised version of this letter on these revisions we just talked about now to the council for its review and approval to send on. And we will have some abstentions from the administration members of the council. Chris?
Yeah, that last part there, David, if Secretary Clauser and others are willing, I think it's important to note that about the administration. It's not knocking them or anything. It's just procedurally, that's the way this has to work. There can be some things that just, that the administration appointees just are not empowered to do as individual members. That's not a bad thing or anything. It's just a procedural necessity. So I think it'd be great if we're able and willing to include that so the general public understands, that's what's going on here, and that there's nothing nefarious going on. There's no conspiracy or anything like that. It's just the nature of the structure of governance.
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Chris. The conference room, I don't know which of you, please go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that as you were speculating about if a council meeting was needed, that I have proposed a time for efficiency's sake of meeting next month, next Monday at 8:30.
Okay.
So as you're deciding.
Yep. And it needs to be noticed, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Jared, last word on this, and then let's see if we're really in agreement on this.
I am good with that. I also recognize that this is very time sensitive with the Joint Fiscal Committee meeting upcoming, and given that it's the summer, that I imagine it could be possible that even if we seek out a date, set a date, warn it, that we don't get a quorum. So I would like to have a backup plan that says, in the event, I think plan A is we convene the council, get the council to vote on this letter, or at least the legislative appointees of the council. But in the event that that does not happen, I would like a backup option to be that the legislatively appointed members of the steering committee, if we can agree to this, would agree to send it on behalf of the legislative members of the steering committee. Because I feel like that's a big reason why the steering committee was created, right? In the event that things need to be addressed between council meetings or that you can't convene the council, I think the ideal thing is that it's sent from the council, and hopefully that will happen. But in the event we just cannot schedule the meeting or cannot get quorum, I wouldn't want to see this very important conversation die before the Joint Fiscal Committee meets to deliberate. Okay.
So Jared's put on the table a plan B option if our plan A doesn't hit a quorum. And so let me just test with folks. We've talked about changes to the letter, and I heard consensus around those changes we talked about, even though we haven't seen the final. I'm sure there'll be opinions. Now we're talking about procedure, and our procedure is schedule a meeting next week. Jane has a tentative schedule date time at 8:30 on Monday morning. And if for whatever reason that doesn't work from a quorum standpoint, then Jared's suggesting that the legislative appointees in this steering committee as a plan B would send it on behalf of themselves, saying, in the interest of time, we're sending this. Any concerns with both plan A and plan B before we wrap this up? Okay. So why don't we treat that as our plan A and our plan B? All right. And Jane, I guess the best thing to do is just set the time and see who's available. I think some sort of doodle or something might be very challenging. So opinion from council, Chris. Do we have council?
A&R does, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so before we activate that plan
wouldn't the
B,
steering committee have the ability to have a letter come from the steering committee? I'm not suggesting it would be on behalf of the council. We're meeting.
Because it's still addressing a policy level inquiry to the legislature. I don't know if the steering committee has that.
I don't see the policy level. I see it as funding for research and analysis that we've already said we want to see happen.
so what I'm hearing from Chris's concern is before a plan B is activated, you'd want to hear from A&R's counsel just to make sure we're not tripping anything up. Is that right, Chris, what you're hearing?
Yeah, I think it's a 5-minute question. I don't think it's a huge lift.
Yeah, okay. So let's add that into our piece of, let's just make sure, check that box, make sure we're actually not stepping into a hornet's nest by, again, not on behalf of anybody else, just on behalf of the members of the legislatively appointed members of the steering committee. Okay, that's our plan B. So this is what I'd like to do, folks. Any concerns with that, final concerns with that plan or questions about what that plan is? Okay, great. So why don't we do this? Let's take some public comment and then we'll wrap up the meeting with looking at our August meeting. But let's first take a little public comment, also try to be responsive to comments we got at the head of the meeting. So let's just pause for public comment here. Cheryl, I see your hands right up there. Please go ahead.
Okay, hi, thanks.
Hi.
Let me just get rid of that. So first I want to say that making things mandatory instead of incentivized, like Chris Campany said, is a good idea, since there have been incentives for a really long time and all sorts of things. And this hasn't resulted in the amount of change that's needed. And I don't see that it would. Another thing with regard to what Chris said was talking about engaging with marginalized populations and the public in general. And you know, he talked about that you are informing the public, but no exchange, really. So that's one thing, or two things, I guess. The main thing that I want to talk about is that the letter that you guys are talking about, really, you're not addressing some of the things that I really think ought to be addressed, which is that the clean heat standard was put forth with biofuels, with biofuels included, which have great impact on agriculture and ecosystems, right? They absolutely should have been in on the discussion, the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And especially seeing that there was so much controversy with regard to biomass, which is directly related to biofuels. And, you know, and which was tabled and then also ignored, especially then look at what happened with the Rygate bill and the extension for 10 years, which is really egregious and ridiculous. Also, you addressed Scott's concerns, but ignored completely the issues brought up by others. And that was so eloquently summarized by Keisha Ram Hinsdale in the Senate proceedings. And it was also ignored completely and totally. Not one person brought this up. And actually, I'm a touch surprised by that, that it was ignored here in your conversation that lasted for a really long time. And, you know, an extra 15 or 20 minutes. So, you know, using biofuel, one of the things that Rich said was that the clean heat standard not going through will make a problem with the 2030 goals for climate and the CAP. Well, using biofuels will make meeting the 2030 goals unattainable completely. You know, you guys want to do the right thing, and I do too, and so do a lot of people, but you're completely ignoring a bunch of stuff that is very valid and scientific, and you're totally ignoring it in the, I don't know in what interest, in the interest of economy, which is, as you all know, it's not going to matter. You know, we've been trying to change, and changing to something that's worse than fossil fuels is not an answer. So I guess that's about it. And I actually have a meeting later, very soon, which is why I couldn't wait for public comment, with Rich's colleague about the clean heat standard. Because the reason that it didn't pass is because there were biofuels in it. It's not because Scott vetoed it, because it would have been overridden, but it didn't get overridden because of the biofuels and because of a lot of work that a lot of people did. And you're not even talking about that, and you're not engaging with people who want to talk about that kind of thing. So that is it. And I think that you should have engagement with people, not just hear them vent, which is what we're doing all the time, which is what I'm doing all the time. You know, have people in the conversation. Doesn't have to be me. There are a whole lot of other people that know about that kind of stuff, the same things that I know. And that's it. Thank you for listening. And I don't think you should send that letter without the other issues being addressed at all from anyone.
Okay. Thanks, Cheryl, for those comments. I appreciate that. Are there other folks who are listening to our meeting today who would like to make a comment? Okay, so I'm not seeing additional comments on that. And I think what's important as this moves into the Climate Council conversation is to carry forward those comments and make sure those are reflected in when the council is reviewing the letter as well. Okay, so we wanted to do one thing before we finish up, and that's making sure we're on the right path for your meeting in August. And Jane threw in the chat, the second to last chat right now, a link to this slide, and I can share my screen with it. And the reason we're doing this is we want to make sure we set up the right kind of meeting for you all, the steering committee, in August, because right now it really is the last scheduled meeting before the council starts meeting again in September. And so we wanted to make sure we're prepping up the right meeting and we have the right kind of presentations and the right kind of conversations. This was an intent by me and with help from Jane and others to sort of say, what's going on and what do we need to be thinking about? In the last meeting where I wasn't at, my colleague Catherine Morris was with you. You settled on some ideas about what success looks like, and I kind of tried to summarize them here. I may have missed something a little bit, but these are the things you talked about in your last meeting about what success looks like for the Climate Council in its meetings in the fall. New recommendations around transportation and biomass coming out of those task groups, and then some prioritization and some guidance for a couple things. The budget process, which we've talked about doing differently this year, and then guidance around for the legislature around the new biennium. And you all last week or last meeting talked about that guidance could include things you want to say about potentially revising GWSA to strengthen the way it talks about resilience and adaptation, how to handle issues that didn't make it into legislation like the clean heat standard. So these are the kinds of things you talked about last time. The steering committee, the Climate Council has 4 planned meetings in the fall, right? So what we thought in August is we want to make a proposal together, and Jane and I and others can come prepared with a straw man proposal of how you schedule out 4 meetings in the fall to get to this, right? And then on the methodology, we know we've struggled as a council to prioritize and lift certain things up in the past. Can we be thoughtful about that methodology when we're doing it for the budget, when we're doing it for the legislature and the biennium and anything else, right? So we wanted to talk about that in August. And then we need to think about the inputs that we would have in August and in September for the council and beyond, right? So Secretary Clauser has agreed to give us a walkthrough of the budgeting process and how the council can be particularly impactful in that. So we have that set up for August. Jane potentially will have ready a legal memo that you had asked for in the last meeting. And Jane, correct me if that's not true, Some of the other things won't be ready, like the cost curve analysis you asked for won't be ready till the end of September. And there may be something else. So these are the kinds of things that you as a steering committee were hoping to really lean into in August so that we can walk into the September, October meetings with the council feeling like we have a plan. So we're a little out of time today to go deep in this, but I would just welcome reactions from the steering committee of do these seems like the right conversations for us to have in our August meeting? Is there anything specific you want to shout out right now so we come prepared for that August meeting?
I would, oh, sorry, it was me.
It's fine. It's fine. Go ahead. I don't see anybody else hand us.
I just want to suggest, I don't know that it's fully fleshed out yet, but I would want to at least have a placeholder space in those August and September meetings for any updates and from especially the transportation task group and the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee regarding the transportation recommendations, because what we had committed to in the revised, originally it was going to be transportation recommendations by June, then it was pushed to November. I just want to make sure that people feel really ready to vote on those recommendations come November. And so I don't know exactly what that looks like in August or September yet. I would want to have more conversations and defer to that transportation task group and cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. But at this point, I think we just need to hold some space and potentially, I don't know the timeline for the biomass recommendations. It feels like that's on a longer timeline than the transportation ones. But I would also want to hear from them, like, how do they see their timeline fitting into the upcoming council agendas?
Right. Thanks, Jared. And I think part of that was I talk about the sequence. It's like, if you actually want to vote on something in November, what needs to have happened in September and October, and yeah, that's great. Are there other reactions to what needs to happen, particularly for planning for your August meeting, so we come ready to rock and roll in August with you all? Anything else? Okay. Jane, am I missing anything?
No, it sounds like what I'm hearing is that the expectation that the presentations in August for the steering committee will just simply be around budget process and how the council could, based on timeliness, plug into that in the fall for the governor's budget process. So Secretary Clauser will lead us on that. As a follow-up, I've been working with legal counsel here to try to answer questions that were raised at the last meeting of the steering committee. We hope to have something by August, but we're continuing to investigate that. So based on that, the main conversation will be a presentation of agendas that lays out a timeline for the council meetings this fall, largely related to budget process. I am still not understanding or getting anything from any of you on what you want to do around prioritization. But at least the budget process will lead to some questions around timing and expectations for the fall. And then, yes, transportation and biomass currently are on the same timeline trajectory. Whether or not either one of those meet the timeline that was considered by the council will be put forward this fall.
Sorry, I'm on mute. We're at the top of the hour. What I'm hearing from you all on this is we're kind of in the right space. We can prepare a meeting in August that gets at these issues. And we'll have that presentation from Secretary Clauser. If there's something else that would be helpful, reach out to Jane or to me, and we'll set that up so that we feel like our August meeting is really on point for what we need to do. Okay. Let me stop sharing. Before we sign off, anything else folks want to say? I will note there's been quite a bit in the chat going on back and forth on biofuels, but is there other things that folks need to say before we sign off today? Okay, great.
Hey, congratulations to Lauren and her family.
Yes, yes. Yes, absolutely. All right, folks. Thanks, everyone. Sorry, going a little bit late. I think we have a plan, particularly on the tricky issue, which is the letter. And you expect to see a new version of that, expect to see an invite and a clear setup of what we're trying to do. All right, take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.